Before we start, I want to ask you a small favor. If you enjoy my content and want more of the horror stories, don't forget to press the like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. This will help me a lot in spreading my videos and attracting more viewers. Working the night shift at the Quick Stop gas station had become routine for me. Most nights were a blur of ringing up snacks, topping off tanks, and catching up on homework between customers. But one night, everything changed when two sketchy guys walked in. It was around 2 a.m. on a Tuesday night, Wednesday morning. The fluorescent lights hummed as I flipped through my psychology textbook behind the counter. The bell above the door jingled, and I looked up to see two disheveled men enter. One was taller, probably mid-30s, with a scraggly beard, greasy hair hanging in his eyes, and a cigarette dangling from his lips. The other was short and pudgy, couldn't have been much older than me. His beady eyes darted around nervously. "Fill it up with regular unleaded," the taller one barked, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. I punched in the payment and handed him the change, stealing glances as they shuffled back outside to the beat-up Ford Escort parked at Pump 4. Something just felt off about those two. A few minutes later, they came back inside, the heavy door slamming behind them. The short one moseyed up to the chips aisle, while the taller guy leaned against the counter, rolling his eyes impatiently. "You got a bathroom here?" he asked gruffly. Yeah. It's through that door to the right," I replied, nodding towards the employees-only door. He grunted and headed that way. I kept my focus on the short guy, grabbing a couple bags of Doritos and a Butterfinger. When the taller one emerged from the bathroom, my heart skipped a beat. Clutched in his hand was my backpack from under the counter, the one with my laptop, notebook, and textbooks inside. "We'll be taking this," he sneered, jangling the backpack. My mouth went dry as I realized they were robbing me. The short guy hurried over, dumping the snacks on the counter and pulling something from his jacket pocket, a switchblade knife. "Okay, man, take it easy," I managed, trying to keep my voice from shaking as I opened the register. They grabbed the cash tray in my backpack, then hustled out to their car. I could only watch in shock and fear as the taillights disappeared into the night. I immediately hit the silent alarm and called the police. An officer responded within minutes, and I gave my statement, my hands still trembling. They took a report but said they'd likely never catch the guys based on my vague description. My mind raced wondering what those tweakers would do with my personal info from my laptop and school things. I requested a day off to deal with canceling cards and getting my identity secured. From then on, working that night shift the Quick Stop gave me a whole new level of paranoia and vigilance. I'd regularly scan customers wondering if it was those same shady robbers coming back. The encounter was burned into my brain, proof that even the most routine nightly lull could turn dangerous in an instant. Story 2. Working the night shift at a 24-hour convenience store had its share of odd encounters, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened one fateful night around 1:00 a.m. The store was dimly lit, with only a few customers passing through. The quiet hum of the refrigerators filled the air as I idly scanned the aisles for any misplaced items. That's when I saw him. A tall man in his late 40s wearing a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low over his eyes. He moved through the store slowly, his footsteps echoing in the silence. There was something about him that set off alarm bells in my head, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. As he browsed the shelves, I kept a watchful eye on him from behind the counter. He would pick up items, inspect them, and then put them back in a meticulous and deliberate manner. It was as if he were searching for something, but he didn't seem to be interested in actually buying anything. The minutes ticked by, and the tension in the store grew. I felt a growing sense of unease as the man continued to roam the aisles, occasionally glancing in my direction. His eyes, obscured by the shadow of his hat, seemed to bore into me with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to shake off my unease, reminding myself that I was just being paranoid. Maybe he was just an eccentric customer with peculiar shopping habits. But then he did something that sent a chill coursing through my veins. The man suddenly stopped in front of one of the store's security cameras, the one that provided a clear view of the counter where I was stationed. He reached up and, with deliberate slowness, adjusted the angle of the camera, tilting it away from me. My heart raced as I watched him tamper with the surveillance equipment. It was a blatant and sinister act, and there was no mistaking his intent. Panic welled up inside me, and I knew I needed to act fast. I picked up the phone and pretended to make a call to the police, hoping that the man would catch on and leave. But he didn't budge. Instead, he continued to stare at me with those unnerving eyes, a malevolent grin tugging at the corners of his lips. My hands were trembling as I hung up the phone. I needed help, and I needed it fast. I reached for the store's panic button, hidden discreetly beneath the counter, and pressed it without hesitation. An alarm blared throughout the store, echoing off the walls. The man's grin faltered for a moment as the shrill sound pierced the air, but he didn't make a move to leave. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small object that glinted menacingly in the dim light. It was a knife. Fear coursed through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. I was trapped behind the counter, defenseless, and the man with the knife was slowly making his way toward me. His footsteps were measured and deliberate, each one bringing him closer to where I stood. I knew I had to act fast, so I grabbed the nearest object I could find, a heavy flashlight, and held it tightly in my trembling hands. The man was only a few feet away now, his eyes locked onto mine with a chilling determination. In that moment, I did something I never thought I was capable of. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled strength, I swung the flashlight with all my might, aiming for the man's head. The impact sent him staggering backward, and the knife clattered to the floor. I didn't waste a second. I sprinted to the exit and burst out of the store, gasping for breath. The sound of approaching sirens filled the night air as the police arrived, responding to the panic button alarm. They apprehended the man, who was now bleeding from a gash on his forehead. As they led him away in handcuffs, I watched with a mix of relief and disbelief. I had survived a chilling encounter that had felt like a nightmare come to life. The man's intentions were unclear, but his actions had left an indelible mark on me, a haunting reminder that danger could lurk in the most ordinary of places, even a 24-hour convenience store in the dead of night. Story 3. I've been taking care of Sheila, a sweet old lady, for many years. Because of her gentle demeanor, it was nice to be with her at night when she needed help. But one night, everything changed. The company called me and informed me that something was wrong with Sheila, and she might need immediate medical attention. Terrified, I rushed to her house, where I had spent countless peaceful nights before. I knew every nook and cranny, every creaking floorboard, and the soothing routine of caring for Sheila. When I entered, I was overwhelmed by a wave of fear. The corridor was dimly lit and seemed eerie. The air was saturated with violence. I called out to Sheila, but all I heard was a faint moaning from her bedroom. My heart was racing when I followed the sound and saw an absolutely shocking sight. Sheila was crouched on the floor, her frail body covered in bruises and blood. She was severely beaten, not just fell down. Horror filled her eyes as they met mine, and my own filled with tears. I gently cradled her head. My mind was unable to comprehend such cruelty towards this kind, defenseless woman who had never harmed a single living soul. I immediately called the police and tried to comfort Sheila as best I could while we waited. She was in shock, barely aware of what had happened. All I could do was stay strong and be her protector after this terrible attack. The investigation quickly revealed a disgusting motive. One of Sheila's relatives wanted to speed up the inheritance of her house and money. Greed drove them to attempt murder when they beat her to a pulp. It turned out that her nephew Gary had accumulated gambling debts and decided that getting rid of his elderly aunt was easier than paying them off. Numerous witnesses said he often complained that he had to wait for the old rat to die to get his hands on her house and assets. Fingerprints and DNA evidence led to the attack on Gary. When he realized that Sheila had survived his initial attack, he went into hiding to avoid prosecution. A few months later, he was found high in an abandoned building on a tip from his bookie. In court, Gary showed no remorse when photos of Sheila's mutilated body were presented. He smugly told the court that she was going to die soon anyway, and eventually he would get it. A completely enraged judge handed Gary the harshest possible sentence, assigning him consecutive terms for attempted murder, assault on an elderly man, and robbery, totaling 35 years. While Gary was rotting in prison, Sheila was slowly recovering from her hellish ordeal, her physical wounds healing long before the emotional ones. She lived in constant fear that the attack would happen again, refusing to leave her house unattended. I stayed by her side until her last days, providing constant care and protecting her from anyone who dared to harm her. Sheila's tragic beating by a man she should have trusted still shakes me to the core. The fact that the greed of a family member led to such debauchery shows what evil people are capable of. Story 4. This happened to me a couple of years back now. You see, being a flight attendant on the red-eye flights was part of my routine, and I thought I had seen it all. But one night, as we cruised at 30,000 feet, a passenger's request would plunge me into a nightmarish encounter I would never forget. The cabin was dimly lit, and most passengers were asleep or trying to get some rest. My rounds had become routine, checking on passengers, serving drinks, and making sure everyone was comfortable. As I moved down the aisle, I noticed a man in his late 30s, his face etched with anxiety. He was fidgeting nervously, his hands trembling as he clutched his armrest. I approached him with a friendly smile, trying to ease his discomfort. "Is there anything I can help you with, sir?" He glanced around as if to ensure no one was listening, then leaned in closer and whispered, "I need to tell you something. Something terrible." My heart raced as I tried to comprehend the gravity of his words. He looked desperate, his eyes darting around nervously. I urged him to continue, wondering what could be so horrifying that he felt compelled to share it with a stranger on a plane. With a quivering voice, he began to recount a story that would send shivers down my spine. He explained that before boarding our flight, he had committed an unthinkable act. He had butchered a family in their own home. My stomach churned as he described the gruesome details of his actions. He had entered their house unaware of who they were and carried out a merciless massacre. The brutality of his words left me in shock, tears swelling up in his eyes as he confessed the horrific crime. He explained that he couldn't bear the weight of his guilt any longer and felt compelled to reveal his dark secret to someone. He had chosen me, a stranger on a plane, as the recipient of his confession. The realization of what I had just heard hit me like a tidal wave. I was trapped in an airplane with a man who had committed unspeakable atrocities, and there was nowhere to run. Fear gripped me, and I struggled to maintain my composure. I knew I had to act carefully. My first instinct was to inform the authorities, but I had to consider the safety of the passengers and crew on board. I couldn't risk causing a panic mid-flight. I tried to engage the man in conversation, hoping to keep him occupied, while I devised a plan to alert the authorities discreetly. He continued to recount the gruesome details of the murder, his voice filled with anguish. As I listened, I realized that the man's mental state was deteriorating rapidly. He seemed tormented by his actions, haunted by the faces of the family he had slaughtered. I took a deep breath and decided to approach the captain with my concerns. I discreetly relayed the man's confession and urged the captain to contact the authorities on the ground. The captain's expression mirrored my own shock and disbelief. With the plane still in flight, we had to proceed cautiously. The authorities were alerted, and they assured us that they would be waiting to apprehend the man upon our arrival. I felt a sense of relief knowing that help was on the way. The flight continued, but the atmosphere on board was tense. Passengers had picked up on the unease, and whispers of concern spread throughout the cabin. I did my best to reassure them that the situation was under control, even though my own anxiety was reaching its peak. Finally, as we touched down at our destination, the man was met by airport security. He was escorted off the plane in handcuffs, his face contorted with a mix of regret and despair. As I disembarked, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I had survived a chilling encounter with a man who had committed an unthinkable crime. Story 5. The clock had just struck midnight, and I was settling into my dimly lit cubicle, surrounded by a bank of computers and the occasional ring of incoming calls. I slipped on my headset, preparing for another long night of customer service. As I answered the next call, I greeted the customer with the usual script, but there was something off about this caller's voice, a sinister undertone that sent a chill down my spine. The caller identified themselves as Mr. Johnson and claimed to be experiencing issues with their home phone line. As I began to troubleshoot, Mr. Johnson's tone grew increasingly disturbing. He started sharing unsettling stories about his neighbors, the Andersons, who lived just a few houses down from him. With each word, Mr. Johnson's voice oozed malice. He described in gruesome detail how he had been tormenting the Andersons for weeks. He spoke of late-night break-ins, strange occurrences around their home, and a series of anonymous threats. I was stunned, unable to comprehend the darkness unfolding on the other end of the line. Mr. Johnson's words painted a horrifying picture of psychological torture and physical harm inflicted on an unsuspecting family. My training hadn't prepared me for this. I tried to keep Mr. Johnson talking, desperately hoping to gather enough information to help the authorities intervene. As he spoke, I discreetly signaled my supervisor to listen in on the call and informed them of the disturbing nature of the conversation. My supervisor contacted the authorities while I kept Mr. Johnson engaged. The minutes dragged on like hours as I listened to Mr. Johnson's twisted tales of terror. He seemed to revel in the fear he had instilled in his neighbors, sharing grisly anecdotes of his actions in chilling detail. Finally, I heard the sirens approaching in the background, a glimmer of hope that the nightmare might come to an end. I continued to talk to Mr. Johnson, trying to keep him on the line until the police arrived. When the officers finally arrived at Mr. Johnson's residence, they apprehended him, ending his reign of terror over the Andersons. I felt a mix of relief and horror as it all came to an end. The next morning, news of Mr. Johnson's arrest and the horrifying ordeal he had inflicted on his neighbors spread like wildfire. The Andersons had endured unimaginable suffering, and the entire community was left shaken. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. The call center, once a place of routine and monotony, had become the backdrop for a real-life horror story. I couldn't help but wonder how many other sinister secrets lurked behind the seemingly ordinary calls that came through our lines. The encounter with Mr. Johnson haunted me long after that night, a grim reminder of the darkness that could lurk within the human soul. It was a chilling experience that I would never forget, a nightmarish journey into the depths of a disturbed mind. Story 6. This happened a couple years ago, when I was working as a flight attendant on the red eyes. You think you've seen it all until some crazy shit goes down at 30,000 feet. It was just another overnight flight, cabin dimly lit, most passengers trying to sleep. I was doing my usual rounds, checking on folks and serving drinks. As I'm coming down the aisle, I notice this guy in his late 30s looking super anxious and fidgety in his seat. Dude is straight up trembling, gripping the armrests like his life depends on it. I go over with my best customer service smile, thinking maybe he's just a nervous flyer and needs some reassurance. "How can I help you, sir?" I ask. That's when he gets this look of sheer panic and leans in close to whisper, "I need to tell you something. Something terrible." At this point, my heart is pounding. What the hell could be so bad that this random passenger is about to unload on me in the middle of a flight? But I keep it professional and just nod for him to go on. That's when he hits me with a confession so messed up it still haunts me. Dude straight up says that before boarding, he broke into some family's house and slaughtered all of them. Man, woman, kids. He starts giving me all the gruesome, twisted details about how he did it. I'm in total shock at this point. Tears are welling up in his eyes as he's purging this horrible secret. Says he just can't live with the guilt and had to confess, even to a total stranger. I'm absolutely sickened, but also low-key terrified that I'm stuck on this metal tube at 30,000 feet with a possible psycho killer. My first thought is we need to get this guy arrested ASAP when we land, but I can't risk causing a panic and endangering other passengers in the air. So I try to keep my cool, nod along and act compassionate, stalling for time while I figure out how to discreetly get the authorities involved. Dude is just rambling on, reliving the horrific details of what he did to this innocent family, crying now about the guilt. I could see he was having some sort of mental break. At some point I was able to quietly get up and inform the pilots about the situation. They were of course shell-shocked but stayed calm and professional. We were able to get the authorities alerted for when we landed. Sure enough, when we touched down there were cops waiting to immediately take the guy into custody. I'll never forget the look on his face. A weird mix of sadness, relief, but also pure batshit crazy mentally ill eyes. Anyway, I gave my statement to security after a beyond effed up shift. Definitely the craziest experience I've had in this job, and I've seen some weird stuff working those red eyes, let me tell you. But nothing quite like having a remorseful family annihilator confess his crimes to me directly at cruising altitude. Just a wild, wild night that I'll never forget. Story 7. It was another long night working the graveyard shift at the Stop and Go on 8th Street. This sketchy part of town was bad enough during daylight, but after midnight, it became a total nightmare. I was restocking the drink coolers when the door chime rang. I turned to see 4 big dudes swaggering in. From their baggy clothes and tats, I could tell they were gang members. My heart started pounding. Just take it easy, I told myself. Smile and don't make any sudden moves. 2 of them split off towards the aisles, while the other 2 approached the counter. Up close, they looked even more intimidating. Mean mugs and dead eyes. "Hey yo, where the Phillies at?" one of them barked. I calmly pointed to the cigars behind me. As I turned back, I noticed the dudes in the aisle stuffing things into their pockets. They were shoplifting. "Hey man, you gotta pay for that stuff," I shouted before I could stop myself. Bad move. The 2 dudes by the counter vaulted over it. Then all 4 surrounded me. I was trapped, like a puny gazelle among starving lions. Aw, did we make the little clerk upset. The biggest one taunted, breath reeking of booze. Well, this just became a totally different situation. The other 3 snickered and took out switchblades, flicking them open simultaneously. The biggest one grabbed me by the shirt. "We're taking whatever we want tonight. Understand? And you're gonna keep that mouth shut. And give us the money too. You hear me?" I was shell-shocked, trying not to wet myself as the blades danced inches from my face. I stammered something, but it was no use. The big guy whipped me across the jaw. I said, Do you understand? Why? Yes. I cry out, feeling a tooth knocked loose from the blow. For the next half hour, they proceeded to terrorize me, destroying the store while I opened the safe and cash registers. They took everything: cash, cigarettes, even the damn TV from the break room. The whole time, they kept those blades ready, daring me to make one wrong move. P, please, just take it and go. I finally blubbered. The big guy replied by slamming me onto the counter, knocking the wind out of me. His arms were like vices as he started squeezing my neck. Oh, we're going. But you ain't calling the cops. In fact, you ain't telling nobody about what happened here. His hands tightened, and I couldn't breathe. Dark spots filled my vision as he snarled in my face. Have a nice, permanent nap, bitch. Just then, bright lights filled the parking lot outside. The thugs looked up, startled by the arriving police sirens. In that split second, I made my move. With every ounce of strength, I grabbed a bottle from the counter and smashed it across the guy's face. He howled, releasing me to clutch his bloody nose. I hit the deck as chaos erupted. Shattered glass, cops shouting, guns cocking. After what felt like an eternity, it went silent except for the idling police engines. I was still alive, miraculously. As they slapped cuffs on the groaning thugs, 2 officers helped me up. You're one lucky son of a bitch, you know that, one of them said, surveying the wreckage. Night clerk called it in after those punks didn't pay for gas. Did a hell of a number on this place. As the cops led the dazed thugs away, the biggest one locked eyes with me. He licked the blood from his busted lips and grinned. This ain't over, clerk. You hear me? It ain't over. I quit this damn place the next morning. Now I'm afraid they'll come after me for getting them busted. I'll never work another graveyard shift as long as I live. Story 8. I used to work the night shift at a local diner in a quiet neighborhood. The diner was a cozy place frequented by regulars who came for late-night coffee and comfort food. My shift typically ended at 1:00 a.m., and I enjoyed the peacefulness of the night as I walked home. But one night, that peacefulness would shatter into a nightmare. As I stepped out of the diner's back entrance, I noticed the street was unusually empty. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by an eerie stillness. I tightened my grip on my bag and quickened my pace, eager to get home. Just a few steps from the diner, I sensed movement behind me. 2 shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by the dim streetlights. Panic surged through me as I realized I was now alone, and these men were approaching me with purpose. Without thinking, I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear their heavy footsteps behind me, growing louder with each passing second. Fear propelled me forward, and I sprinted down the dimly lit streets, desperate to escape my pursuers. The men's voices rang out, taunting me with menacing threats. I could feel their presence closing in, and it was clear they were not going to give up easily. My mind raced, trying to figure out where to go for safety. My apartment was still a few blocks away, and the thought of leading these strangers to my door was unthinkable. I veered off the main road, hoping to lose them in the maze of residential streets. My breath came in ragged gasps as I darted through alleyways and across darkened parks. I could hear the men behind me, their footsteps relentless. My phone was in my pocket, but I dared not call the police just yet. I needed a plan, an escape route. I spotted a convenience store up ahead, its bright fluorescent lights a beacon of hope. As I burst through the doors, I shouted to the clerk for help, desperately explaining the situation. The kind clerk immediately called the police while guiding me into a back room. I crouched there, trembling and terrified. As the minutes crawled by, the police arrived swiftly, and I listened anxiously to their conversation with the clerk through the thin walls. They arrested the two men who had a history of violent offenses. My heart was still pounding as I gave my statement to the police, recounting the terrifying chase through the deserted streets. The officers assured me that I had done the right thing, and they were relieved to have caught the men before they could harm me. They offered to escort me home, and I accepted their protection, grateful for their presence. Story 9. I was working the night shift at my local Waldbaum's back when it used to be open 24 hours a day. There would normally be fewer than 10 customers throughout my shift, but I wouldn't get to sit around and do nothing. They wanted me to work on stock when I wasn't helping a customer. It was a bigger Waldbaum's, so oftentimes there may have been one other person in the building, whether it be someone working on stock or someone cleaning. This night, I was the only one working. I was working stock in the cereal aisle when I heard something fall over on the other side of the shelf in the next aisle over. I would always hear the door to the store sliding open. It was the loudest thing ever, so it kind of caught me off guard that there might have been a customer in the building. Of course, it wasn't weird yet, not until I looked to my left and saw a man standing by the edge of the aisle shooting me a blank stare. "Do you need something, sir?" I asked him. "No, but could you just point me to the eggs?" he said. He wasn't normal looking. His face looked weird, not exactly ugly, just unusual, like his upper lip kind of came out too far, almost like a Simpsons character. I was a bit uncomfortable that I had to deal with ringing him up. I hurried to finish the cereal aisle, and when I was done, I began to bring the U-boat cart to the back room. I was stopped halfway when the same guy cut me off through the middle section of the aisle. I want to note, this guy was probably in his mid-30s, and at the time, I was only 22, though I looked much younger. The guy stopped me and started trying to make awkward small talk. He started by asking me my name, how old I was, if and where I went to school, and why I was doing the night shift. His questions started to get weirder when he asked me if I went to parties a lot, and if I had a girlfriend. I told him I didn't, and he asked me if I've ever had a boyfriend while putting his hand on my shoulder. I immediately started walking away with the cart, but he followed me. I told him I wasn't into whatever he was thinking about. I went faster and faster until I finally made it to that storage room. He didn't follow me in. I wasn't supposed to stay back there for extended periods of time to avoid customer theft. I decided it would be best to just wait for him by the register so that he would ring his stuff up and leave. But I waited there for at least 20 minutes. He never came. I decided he was gone, and whether he stole the eggs and something else, there wasn't anything I could do now. I had to go to the bathroom. So I took a quick jog to the back of the store and into the employee bathroom. Moments after sitting on the toilet, my heart dropped into my stomach as I heard the bathroom door open. I choked the urge to say something like, "You can't be in here," but I didn't want to give away my position. I lifted my legs so that I wouldn't be visible from under the stall, and what happened next was simply horrifying. I sat there for the longest time, looking at the floor, not moving a muscle. When I finally looked up, I could see an eye peering through the crack of the stall door. I screamed. I knew I was trapped. I knew I had one shot at making a move. I grabbed the box cutter in my pocket and began sliding it through the crack of the door, forcing him to move his eye away. I took that chance to slam the stall door open in his face and hightail it out of the bathroom and all the way out of the store. I called my boss at least 5 times before he finally picked up and explained everything. He told me to call the cops, and so I did. Of course, the man wasn't in the store anymore by the time the cops showed up. I only did the night shift twice after that, and luckily didn't see the man again. Story 10. It was 2 years ago. I was called in to do the night shift, 10:00 p.m. to 4:00 a.m. at 7-Eleven since somebody called out. The store was located on a busy road in a rather quiet and rural area. During the night shift, You could expect anywhere from 10 to 20 people to come in to buy a beer or something else. This one particular night, there was this one guy, mid-20s, that came in. He started making weird noises, like loud yelling noises. I assumed he had some kind of mental disability. In fact, my brother has a mental disability, so I immediately felt sympathy for the guy. He walked up to the counter without any items, with his head facing me, but his eyes were looking up at the ceiling. I felt uncomfortable. I honestly didn't know how to deal with it. I tried speaking with him, but he only responded in loud noises. I kept checking if he was with someone outside, but he was alone. There weren't any cars in the parking lot, so I assumed he walked. He stood there for so long, looking up at the ceiling and making noises, that I tried to get him out by handing him a bag of chips and telling him he can go. I tried finding some kind of number to call for someone to help him. Then out of nowhere, he finally turned around and walked out of the store. I felt so horrible for the man, but at the same time, I felt a bit creeped out. About an hour later, the phone on the counter rang. I picked up to hear the familiar yelling sounds. I'm the man from earlier. It caught me off guard. I didn't know what to think other than this has to be some kind of prank. I hung up on them and was now becoming paranoid of my surroundings, constantly checking the outside through the windows. Come 4 o'clock, the person working after me came in, finally allowing for me to go home. It wasn't my problem anymore. I got home and threw all my stuff on the table, ready to get to sleep. But my phone rang within a minute after entering the door. I felt a chill run down my spine. Why would someone be calling at 4 a.m.? I could only imagine it was bad news. I braced myself and picked up the phone. It was the man again. I felt sick to my stomach as I listened to the loud noises he made. I struggled to slam the phone to the receiver. All night, I felt like I was being watched, even with all the blinds shut, and I could swear I heard strange noises coming from all over my house. I refused to get any sleep until the sun came up. Weeks passed, and I had forgotten about the incident until one day, when going into the basement for the first time in a while, I found that papers had been scattered all over the floor. And when I went into the basement closet, I found writing on the walls. 7-Eleven had been written in Sharpie on the wall, along with the address to the 7-Eleven I worked at and my house address. The most disturbing part, I also found various kitchen knives, along with a large pocket knife, sitting in the closet. What started out as seemingly just an innocent person turning into something of a prank ultimately turned into something much more horrifying. He had been living down there for God knows how long, and I'm just grateful that for whatever reason, he changed his mind and left because I haven't seen or heard from him since. All I can say is that man is dangerously ill. Story 11. I've worked in the K-9 unit for 9 years, and I've worked my fair share of graveyard shifts. I've definitely come across weird things at night, but I'll never forget this one night. I worked with my dog, Sammy, a German Shepherd. She was 2 years old at the time, and it was still kind of new to the job, just like me. I was driving down a road surrounded by crops when I spotted a suspicious-looking white van parked inside the crops. Both doors were open. I flashed my lights to try and draw out whoever was there. Nobody came out, so I parked and scanned the place out quickly. Nobody was in sight, so I took Sammy with me to track down the driver of the van. Sammy started going crazy when we reached the trunk of the van. She was pulling so hard, she almost broke off the leash. I opened the trunk of the van, and a blast of foul air hit me in the face. I almost passed out from the mix of the horrible smell and the pure shock of what I saw. In the trunk, I counted 7 full body bags, each with a pair of feet sticking out at the bottom. I requested immediate backup with my radio. I heard the sound of a twig snapping nearby, and Sammy just lost it. I lost grip of the leash, and she took off into the crops. I pulled out my gun and followed the sounds of her barking as each and every cloud hit me in the face. I felt as if something would reach out and grab me. I stopped when I could no longer hear Sammy's barking, but as I stopped, the sounds of movement did not. I realized I heard movement in all directions. I had never experienced such fear in my life. I stood still as the movement around me stopped, and then out of nowhere, I felt two arms wrap around my throat. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't fight. I was going to die. And then I heard the sound of Sam's bark, followed by the scream of the man choking me as Sammy bit down on his leg. The next thing I did is something that I still question if it was appropriate doing to this day. I turned around and pulled the trigger, killing the man. I grabbed Sammy by the leash and ran all the way back to the car. I could tell people were following us from behind. I managed to make it to the car safely and drive 1/4 mile down the road. I didn't stop to see which way they went. I didn't hold my ground. I fled like a coward. I cared much more about our lives than I did this job, and I'll still say that today. But it still pains me knowing how much of a coward I was. Backup arrived shortly, but the van was gone. I even failed to get the plate number on dashcam video or even just writing it down. This was within my first few months on the force, but it made me feel like absolute nobody for months to come. I, someone who's sworn to protect, let a van full of killers get away. Story 12. I had just started working a graveyard shift at a grocery store in a big city on the West Coast. We were situated in the middle of a residential area, and we had at least one cashier on the floor at all times. The other cashier I worked with every night was named Barry. Barry was an old man who used to live in Chicago. I didn't learn a whole lot about him while I worked with him, as he was pretty secretive about everything. He was a nice guy, though. He was the perfect example of a grumpy old man. You know, the kind that would yell, "Get off my lawn," and was absolutely fearless. They had a hired third-party security guard, and I used the word security loosely since it would be illegal for him to actually apprehend anyone. His job was to patrol the aisles in an effort to ward off thieves. On this particular evening, as I started my shift, I noticed a gentleman in nothing but dirty sweats lounging at our outdoor furniture display up at the front, which was only a couple of yards from my station. I just ignored him and did my job, since it took more brain power than I could actually spare, and it was the busiest time of the day for us. He stayed there for a good while until our security walked up to start a conversation, and he got scared and left pretty quickly. Fairly soon after, Barry approached me and told me that the guy was a local vagrant, and that if he comes back, that I should let him know because he had a history of harassing customers, especially for money, seeing as I'm a very short girl with, at the time, very little strength. I told him I would let him know and went back to scanning items. Hours passed by, and when I returned to my station, I see him at the display again. Immediately, I called back to Barry and let him know what's going on. I've never seen someone get from the back of the store to the front in such a short amount of time. Right behind him is the security guy. The store is pretty much empty at this point, except for maybe 2 or 3 lonely shoppers getting their 2 o'clock a.m. fix of chocolate, mac and cheese, or other comfort food. I tried to keep my head down as Barry confronts the homeless man. I can hear the man start to get a little bit angry, slowly building up his yelling until he startles me, and I turn around to watch what's going on, hand on the phone to call the police if I need to. The man stands up, and he's really tall, like really tall compared to all 3 of us. We all hovered around the low 5 foots, and he shoves Barry back. Barry went to move forward, and the guy pulls out a long knife that he must have taken from our minuscule aisle of kitchenwares, yelling about how he needs someplace to sleep, and he swings at Barry, who dodged it. Security hightailed it back to me at that point, and I called the police. In the meantime, it was just us 3 and this crazy hobo with a knife and an intent to hurt someone. Barry gave him space, and kept his attention while I talked to dispatch. It would take them 5 minutes to get to the store. Barry tried his best to talk the man out of his frenzy. And for a while, it seemed like it was working. Then the guy started advancing with a white-knuckle grip on the knife. Barry stood his ground for the most part, but the man caught up too quick and swung again. Barry tripped, and I thought for sure that was it. I was going to watch someone get stabbed, and there wasn't anything I could do about it. Apparently, I had made some sort of noise because he turned back and made eye contact with me. I couldn't read his face. My mind was just blank. The security guy decided now was his time to shine, and he yelled something. I can't even remember what he yelled. Probably something about the police. The man bolted, and I watched through the storefront windows as he ran around the building and disappeared into the dark. The police eventually arrived and searched for him. They caught him, I heard, and he was sent to prison for aggravated assault. I believe Barry was grumbling louder than usual, his way of expressing shock, I suppose, and we both finished our shifts before going home. That wasn't the last time I ever witnessed scuffles between Barry and aggravated people, but it was the only time they ever had a weapon. This story takes place only about 9 months ago or so, and it still works me up to this day. Story 13. I used to work the night shift at a local diner in a quiet neighborhood. The diner was a cozy place frequented by regulars who came for late-night coffee and comfort food. My shift typically ended at 1:00 a.m., and I enjoyed the peacefulness of the night as I walked home. But one night, that peacefulness would shatter into a nightmare. As I stepped out of the diner's back entrance, I noticed the street was unusually empty. The usual hum of activity had been replaced by an eerie stillness. I tightened my grip on my bag and quickened my pace, eager to get home. Just a few steps from the diner, I sensed movement behind me. 2 shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, their faces obscured by the dim streetlights. Panic surged through me as I realized I was now alone, and these men were approaching me with purpose. Without thinking, I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear their heavy footsteps behind me, growing louder with each passing second. Fear propelled me forward, and I sprinted down the dimly lit streets, desperate to escape my pursuers. The men's voices rang out, taunting me with menacing threats. I could feel their presence closing in, and it was clear they were not going to give up easily. My mind raced, trying to figure out where to go for safety. My apartment was still a few blocks away, and the thought of leading these strangers to my door was unthinkable. I veered off the main road, hoping to lose them in the maze of residential streets. My breath came in ragged gasps as I darted through alleyways and across darkened parks. I could hear the men behind me, their footsteps relentless. My phone was in my pocket, but I dared not call the police just yet. I needed a plan, an escape route. I spotted a convenience store up ahead, its bright fluorescent lights a beacon of hope. As I burst through the doors, I shouted to the clerk for help, desperately explaining the situation. The kind clerk immediately called the police while guiding me into a back room. I crouched there, trembling and terrified. As the minutes crawled by, the police arrived swiftly, and I listened anxiously to their conversation with the clerk through the thin walls. They arrested the 2 men who had a history of violent offenses. My heart was still pounding as I gave my statement to the police, recounting the terrifying chase through the deserted streets. The officers assured me that I had done the right thing, and they were relieved to have caught the men before they could harm me. They offered to escort me home, and I accepted their protection, grateful for their presence. That night forever changed me. Story 14. My second job ever was delivering Chinese food at a local corner Chinese place in 2008. It was one of my best-paying jobs to date, mainly because of how fast-paced the place was and how many deliveries, aka tips, I would make. It was a busy Thursday night, a half hour before closing time. We had 3 delivery guys working, myself included. My boss was always a hard ass. As usual, he told me to make the delivery and be back quickly. The address led to a town 5 miles away though, so I knew this would be a longer trip. But the longer ones always had the better tips. I still remember the order. It was just an order of wonton soup and rice. It was a 15-minute drive. I pulled up to the house, and it was not exactly the most appealing area of town. I stepped out of the car with a small brown bag of food, and before I stepped up the curb from the street, I stopped and looked up at the upstairs window of the house I was delivering to. There was half of someone's face peeking at me, and by half, I mean I could just see someone's eyes on the top of their nose as if they were trying to hide. I didn't know what to think. It didn't look like some kid. It looked like a grown man. All I could do was continue walking to the door. I found a note on the door saying, "Doorbell broken. Asleep, door unlocked, money on table. Please come inside and leave food on table." The note was so bizarre, I had to take a picture of it. You know how they say red flags can go off in your head in a split second? Well, that's exactly what I was feeling. I stepped back a few feet to look up at the window again. The person wasn't at the window anymore. I knew they were asleep, so why would they leave a note like this? I tried to rationalize. Maybe it's a really socially awkward person who prefers not to engage with a delivery person. I slowly turned the knob, and yes, the door was unlocked. There was no light at all in there. I couldn't distinguish where the table was that the money was allegedly sitting on. I tried going left, found myself in what I assumed was the kitchen because I could hear a fridge nearby. Like I said, it was dark as hell in there. I finally came up with the brilliant idea of using my phone as a light. I put the brightness up all the way, and that's when I saw the silhouette of a person in the corner of the kitchen. No features, nothing, just the silhouette of someone. At that moment, I dropped the bag of food on the floor and walked out the front door back to my car. I never looked back at that sketchy-ass house, nor did I ever go back to that sketchy-ass part of town. My boss was pissed, even after I explained it to him, but that's just how he is. I did another delivery that night and went home and couldn't sleep all night, thinking about what could have happened in that house had I actually gone up to that table. Story 15. I used to work the night shift as a pharmacy technician, and I can tell you that it's usually a quiet and uneventful job. Most nights, I fill prescriptions, restock shelves, and maybe help a few customers who couldn't sleep and decided to pick up their medication in the middle of the night. But one night, something happened that still sends shivers down my spine. It was a rainy and cold night, and I had just finished refilling the pill dispensers when the phone rang. I picked it up, expecting it to be a doctor calling in a prescription or a nurse with a question about a medication. But the voice on the other end was neither of those. "Hello," the voice said, and it sounded shaky and anxious. "I need your help, please. You have to listen." I asked what was wrong, and the person on the line began to explain that they were in excruciating pain. They described their symptoms in detail, and it was clear that they were in distress. They begged for advice on what to take or do to alleviate the pain. I explained that I couldn't diagnose over the phone, and that they should consider calling 911 or visiting the nearest emergency room. But they refused, saying they couldn't leave their house, which was miles away from the hospital. As the conversation continued, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. The person's descriptions of their pain were becoming more and more extreme, and their voice seemed to change, becoming almost inhuman. It was as if they were trying to mimic human suffering but failing miserably. I glanced at the clock and realized it was close to 3:00 a.m. I was alone in the pharmacy, and the feeling of isolation added to my discomfort. I tried to stay calm and professional. But the person on the other end of the line was relentless, insisting that I help them. They started to make strange, disjointed statements. They claimed that they knew where I lived, that they were watching me, and that they could see me right at that moment. Panic surged through me, and I hung up the phone, my heart pounding. I tried to shake off the unsettling call, convincing myself that it was just a prank or a disturbed individual seeking attention. But as I turned to go back to my work, I froze in my tracks. A chill ran down my spine as I saw a figure standing outside the pharmacy window. It was dark outside, but the figure was illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. They were wearing tattered clothes, and their face was obscured by a hood. My mind raced as I realized that this person matched the description the caller had given earlier. I fumbled to call the police, all the while keeping an eye on the figure outside. But as I looked away for just a moment to dial 911, they disappeared into the night. The police arrived soon after, but there was no sign of the mysterious figure. They took a report and assured me that they would patrol the area. I went home that morning shaken and unable to shake the feeling of being watched. In the days that followed, I couldn't help but wonder if the unsettling call and the appearance of the hooded figure were connected. I tried to put it behind me and continue with my job, but the fear lingered. I never received another call from that person, and I never saw the hooded figure again. But the memory of that night and the chilling encounter still haunts me. I'll never know who they were or what their intentions were, but I can't help but feel that I narrowly escaped something truly terrifying that night. Story 16. I used to work the night shift at a small, unassuming office building. It was a job that paid the bills, but it was far from exciting. Most nights were routine, with little more than the hum of fluorescent lights and the steady drone of the photocopier to keep me company. But one night, everything changed, and I found myself in the midst of a chilling encounter that would haunt me forever. It was around 2:00 a.m., and I was hunched over my desk, trying to stay awake. My eyelids felt heavy, and I longed for the first light of dawn to signal the end of my shift. That's when I heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whisper coming from a hallway just outside my office. I strained my ears to listen, convinced it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then I heard it again, this time more distinct. It was a voice, low and raspy, muttering words I couldn't quite make out. My heart began to race as I realized I was now alone in the building. My first instinct was to call security, but the phone on my desk was dead. Panic set in as I contemplated my options. I could stay in my office and hope that whoever was out there would go away, or I could venture into the hallway and confront the intruder. Summoning every ounce of courage, I crept toward the door and cautiously peered out into the dimly lit corridor. My office was at the end of a long hallway, and the source of the whisper seemed to be coming from further down. I couldn't see anyone, but the sound was unmistakable. As I moved closer, the words being whispered became clearer. It was a disjointed, eerie monologue filled with strange references and unsettling threats. I couldn't make sense of it, but the tone of the voice sent shivers down my spine. It was a voice filled with malevolence and intent. I knew I had to do something, so I mustered all my courage and began to walk cautiously down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer I got, the more the words began to form a coherent sentence, and I realized with horror that they were directed at me. The voice was saying things that no one should have known, details about my life, my family, and my deepest fears. It was as though the intruder had access to my most private thoughts and memories. I felt exposed and vulnerable, trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I reached the source of the voice, a janitor's closet, and slowly pushed the door open. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. There, huddled in the corner, was a disheveled figure, their eyes wild with madness. It was a coworker, someone I had known for years, but they were no longer the person I remembered. They continued to mutter their eerie monologue, their gaze fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to talk to them, to understand what had driven them to this point, but their words grew more nonsensical and menacing. I backed away from the closet, my mind racing. I knew I had to get out of there, but the building was a labyrinth of darkened hallways and locked doors. I couldn't risk running into anyone else who had been affected by whatever had possessed my coworker. I made my way back to my office and locked the door, my heart pounding in my chest. I reached for my phone and called the police, explaining the bizarre and terrifying situation I had found myself in. They assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay put. As I waited in my darkened office, I could hear the footsteps of the police officers approaching. When they finally arrived, they took my coworker into custody, and I watched as they were led away, still muttering their unsettling monologue. I was left to pick up the pieces of that night, trying to make sense of what had happened. My coworker was never the same after that, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something truly malevolent had taken hold of them. I quit my job shortly afterward, unable to shake the trauma of that chilling encounter. To this day, I don't know what caused my coworker to descend into madness, and I don't want to find out. All I know is that some mysteries are best left unsolved, and some encounters are better left in the darkness of the past. Story 17. Delivering dairy products to homes and businesses in the quiet suburban neighborhood where I grew up was a peaceful job, and I enjoyed the solitude of the early morning hours when most of the world was still asleep. But one fateful morning, as the clock struck just past 4:00 a.m., I stumbled upon an encounter that would haunt my nightmares for the rest of my life. It was a typical morning, or so I thought. The streets were shrouded in darkness, and the only sounds were the soft hum of my delivery truck and the occasional chirping of crickets. I had a routine route, and I knew it like the back of my hand. Everything seemed ordinary until I reached the Sullivan's house. As I approached their driveway, I noticed something strange. A door that I knew should have been securely shut was ajar. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as I parked my truck and approached the house with caution. The soft glow of a porch light cast eerie shadows on the front steps, and I could hear faint, muffled noises coming from inside. It was as if there were whispers in the darkness, voices I couldn't quite make out. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I crept closer to the open door, my footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden porch. The voices grew louder, and I could now distinguish the frantic hushed tones of a man and a woman, fear evident in their inflections. As I considered the possibility of an intruder or a domestic dispute, summoning all my courage, I peered through the narrow opening of the door, and what I saw froze me in my tracks. The Sullivans, a seemingly ordinary couple who had been part of my route for years, were standing in the dimly lit living room, but they were not alone. A tall figure loomed over them, shrouded in darkness. The intruder's face was obscured, but I could see the glint of a knife in their hand, its blade catching the faint light. The man and woman were pleading for their lives, their voices trembling with terror. I knew I had to act, to call for help, to do something. But fear rooted me to the spot, rendering me helpless as I watched the horrifying scene unfold before my eyes. The intruder raised the knife, and I knew I couldn't bear to witness what would come next. Just as the blade descended, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air, and the world seemed to slow down. It was the Sullivans' young daughter, who I hadn't noticed until that moment. Her scream jolted me into action, and I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with trembling hands. The dispatcher answered, and I frantically whispered the details of the nightmare I was witnessing. She assured me that help was on the way, and I hung up, praying that it would arrive in time. In the minutes that felt like an eternity, I watched as the intruder turned toward the young girl, their knife still gleaming ominously. But before they could take another step, the blaring sirens of approaching police cars shattered the silence. The intruder fled into the darkness, leaving the Sullivans and their daughter shaken but alive. The police arrived just in time to give chase, but the assailant managed to escape. The Sullivans were grateful for my call, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been a helpless witness to their terror. I often wonder what drove someone to commit such a horrifying act, but I'll never know. All I can do is carry the burden of what I've witnessed and hope that the Sullivans can find some semblance of peace in the aftermath of that chilling encounter. Story 18. My line of work was digging up streets and repairing gas pipes. It was grueling work, but it paid the bills. One chilly night, I was on the job with my crew, a group of 5 dedicated workers all bundled up in reflective gear. The orange cones and flashing signs marked our presence on the desolate road as we dug away, the dull thud of our shovels echoing in the quiet of the night. It was around midnight when I heard the distant hum of a car engine approaching. It wasn't unusual for the occasional car to pass by even at this hour, as some folks prefer driving at night to avoid traffic. This car, however, struck me as odd. It was an old sedan, its headlights piercing the darkness. It slowed down as it approached our worksite, and I could see the silhouette of the driver behind the wheel. The car continued past us, and I thought nothing more of it until a few moments later, when I heard the unmistakable sound of brakes screeching. The sedan had stopped, and its reverse lights flickered on. I exchanged puzzled glances with my crewmates as the car backed up toward us, the driver's side window rolling down to reveal a man inside. He looked disheveled, his face etched with deep lines of weariness. His eyes, however, were sharp and intense, locking onto me as though he could see into my very soul. It sent shivers down my spine. The man leaned out of the window, his voice low and eerie. "You're digging in the wrong place," he said, his words carrying a weight of foreboding that was impossible to ignore. Confused and more than a little unnerved, I replied, "We have the work orders and permits, sir. We're in the right spot." The man's expression darkened, and he shook his head slowly. "No, you don't understand. You're digging in the wrong place. You need to stop." My crewmates and I exchanged alarmed glances. The situation was bizarre and unsettling. We had a job to do, and this man's cryptic warnings were causing tension to mount. But something about his demeanor made it difficult to dismiss him entirely. As if sensing our hesitation, the man's tone grew more urgent. "I've seen things, terrible things buried beneath this road. You have to stop before it's too late." I was torn between duty and the eerie feeling that this man knew something we didn't. Before I could respond, he pulled away from the window and sped off into the night, leaving us in a cloud of dust. We continued working, but the encounter had cast a shadow over the night. The man's warning lingered in our minds, and a sense of dread settled in like a thick fog. We couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with our task. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, we finally finished the job. But the sense of dread that had taken hold of us remained. We packed up our equipment, and I couldn't help but glance down at the freshly dug trench. What had the man meant? What had he seen? To this day, I still wonder about the chilling encounter on that desolate road and the cryptic warning that had accompanied it. Story 19. Darkness. Working as a night sewer inspector in the heart of the city was never glamorous. My job involved crawling through tight, dimly lit underground tunnels, navigating a labyrinth of pipes and filth. It was a lonely and eerie existence, made even more unsettling by the strange encounter I had one night. It was past midnight when I descended into the depths of the city's sewer system. The flickering fluorescent lights provided little comfort as I trudged through the muck and waste. The air was thick with a putrid stench of sewage, and every sound seemed to echo endlessly through the tunnels. As I made my way deeper into the maze of pipes, I began to hear something unusual, a faint rhythmic tapping sound. It was out of place in the otherwise desolate sewer, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I followed the noise, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and soon I discovered its source. There, in a narrow alcove, I found a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard boxes and discarded debris. And inside this grim shelter was a person, huddled in the dim light. I couldn't make out much about them at first, just the silhouette of a human figure. "Hey, what are you doing down here?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, and my unease grew. I cautiously approached, revealing the face of a middle-aged man with wild, unkempt hair and a long, ragged beard. His eyes, wide and unblinking, seemed to reflect a dim light, like a trapped animal. I live here," he mumbled, his voice quivering. My heart pounded in my chest. People didn't live in the sewers. The man's appearance was hauntingly tragic. His clothes tattered and filthy, his skin covered in sores and grime. I asked him how he had ended up here, and he began to ramble incoherently. He mentioned losing his job, his home, and his family. He spoke of a downward spiral that had led him to this wretched existence beneath the city. I felt a mixture of pity and fear as I listened to his disjointed tale. I couldn't leave him down here, but I couldn't bring him with me either. My job was to inspect, not to play social worker. With a heavy heart, I left him a bottle of water and some protein bars, promising to notify the authorities and get him help. As I turned to leave, he grabbed my arm with surprising strength, his eyes suddenly sharp and intense. "You can't tell anyone about me," he hissed, his grip tightening. "I won't go back." I tried to pull away, but he was relentless. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of the situation. The man was unhinged, desperate, and capable of anything. In that dim underground chamber, I had a chilling encounter that left me shaking to my core. I managed to break free from his grasp. Leaving him behind in the foul depths of the sewer, I fled the tunnel, my heart pounding, vowing never to return. I did report the encounter to the authorities, but I never learned what became of the man. It haunted my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had left him to suffer in the darkness.